This little PC beside me is actually the most powerful PC I have built here at Tech Yes City to date, and the funny thing is, it's also the smallest, coming in with a capacity size of 7.5 liters and featuring an i9-12900K and also an RTX 3080 Ti. Now you may be stopping me there and going, Brian, putting these components in an ITX case is not a good idea. The heat is just simply going to overwhelm the components and you're going to be left with one hot, massive potato. And that would be true, except in today's video, we are going to be undervolting heavily this PC right here, and we have used some very important components in order to make this build work properly. So let's get into it and find out how to make the best Mini-iTX rig in 2022.
If you're looking for a feature-packed motherboard that won't break the bank, then today's video sponsor ASRock has you covered. With the X570 Riptide, you get access to PCIe 4.0, smart access memory, lightning game ports which separate the keyboard and mouse on their own controllers for no jitters, and an ASRock graphics card holder. Links in the description below to find out more.
Welcome back to Tech Yes City, and this right here is the new travel PC, which features a PC case from Aliexpress. And when I first saw this case, I was thinking, well, it has everything that I want from an ITX case. It's very small. It's also got a handle on top, which is very durable. And it features clear acrylic sides on the front and back. And this was important because I didn't want glass if I'm traveling, and that if the case gets knocked around, and you could have one massive problem on your hands. And so going with the acrylic sides, even though it's kind of a cheaper option, it does work out better for travel, in my opinion. Now, the best thing about this case is it's based off the Dan A4 chassis. Very similar, but again, has those two different features that I was looking for and comes in with a much cheaper price tag, where from AliExpress, you can buy this for 75 USD delivered or 85 USD with the PCIe riser cable, which I do recommend since this PCIe riser cable is matched perfectly for this case in terms of its length. The next key components in order to make this happen was the ASRock Phantom Gaming ITX B4Z690 motherboard. This features an 11-phase VRM with also tantalum capacitors on board, and on top of that you've got PCIe Gen 5, you've also got two M.2 NVMe slots, as well as a Realtek ALC 1220 onboard audio solution. Now, I did test this outside the case with just the 12900K, and the temperatures were very impressive, especially for an ITX board. But there was a big hurdle in terms of mounting this ITX board in this case. And that mainly came with the actual cooler that I was using, which is the Noctua NH-L12S. And this is a low profile CPU cooler. However, this is where we came into a big problem in order to make everything work. And that was the cooler was 70 mil high, and we really only have around 62 mil clearance for our cooler height in this case. But what we did here was we did a little bit of a janky solution in order to get this cooler working, in that we actually bent the cooler manually down to make it a little bit lower, but in the process we were hitting the heatsink on the motherboard. So I actually had to remove the whole heatsink covering the VRM on this Z690 motherboard. And so what this means is that we won't have as good as a VRM temperature that we would like to, though since we are going to be undervolting, this won't be a problem in my opinion. Though after we barely got this cooler to mount with the motherboard, we were then faced with another problem, and that was the DDR5 memory, in that we couldn't use any memory with heat sinks on it because we needed as low as a height as possible in order to make the cooler fit over the RAM. And so in this case, we had to go with the crucial DDR5 4800 MHz memory 2x16 gigabyte sticks. And so since this is currently the lowest profile memory I can get for the DDR5 platform, it actually ended up just working out just like the cooler. The other components used in this build, we've got a PCIe Gen 4 M.2 from Corsair, and this actually can go under the heatsink on the ITX board from ASRock. Now, if you are using Gen 4 SSDs, you will generally want to have them covered with a heatsink, but most Gen 4 SSDs will include a heatsink from the get-go, just like this Corsair one. But since the ASRock board does have a heatsink that covers both top and bottom, I decided to use that instead. And then there's of course the power supply to power this whole build, which we went with the Corsair SF750, which is a platinum rated power supply with also shorter cables than what you're used to with a regular ATX power supply. And this is actually pretty crucial in this build to do this, because we have to minimize as much components as we use in order to fit everything in this build. Though after we had that one side completed, there is then the rear spot where you can mount your graphics card. In this case, says you can mount up to 305 millimeters, and we went with the RTX 3080 Ti Founders Edition card, and this fit absolutely fine with the riser cable just managing to plug in. It is a bit of a tight fit, but it will work. Though I will say, if you want to put a graphics card that has a wider PCB, they may not fit properly inside this case. Though I would recommend going with the regular 11.5mm with PCBs, and of course, make sure the cooler is no longer than 305mm. So booting this PC up, straight away, if we try to run a benchmark, our CPU will get to 100 degrees and start throttling very quickly, not to mention the high power consumption. However, going into the BIOS, we can then lower the clock speeds, and I decided to lower the clock speeds to 4.5 gigahertz and also drop the voltage with an offset of minus 100 millivolt. And so what this does is it gives the i9-12900K less power to work with, but it also lowers the clock speeds so it doesn't have to work as hard. And so after running benchmarks, we were getting Cinebench R23 scores of 25,000 points, and also getting temperatures that topped 80 degrees. So this was a very good sweet spot out of the box. However, if you do want to fine tune your undervolts or overclocks, you can download the Intel Extreme utility, which in this case we did, which we managed to fine tune and undervolt the 12900K even more, down 35 millivolt, which left us with power consumption around 130 watts, which before that we were having power consumption maximizing at about 145 watts. So fine-tuning your CPU can get you really good results, but another reason for this pretty solid result is also the power supply. Since it does have low ripple and it is platinum rated, it's going to be very good for powering these components, whether you're overclocking or undervolting. Also, while we're in the BIOS, we can lock in the XMP 3.0 profiles, which in this case is 4800 megahertz, and that's all these crucial sticks can do, even though some other sticks out there can go as high as 5600 on the XMPs as well as 6000 megahertz. Since we are dealing with Mini-iTX and we don't have the best airflow in this case, we will leave it at that, and hopefully it won't have any hiccups. So now that our CPU and memory are running fine, it's now time to look at the graphics card, which is easily the highest power consumption part in this build and actually most gaming PCs. So the RTX 3080 Ti does use out of the box, it will go over 300 watts on default in a benchmark. However, in this case, since we really want to lower the power consumption as much as possible, we can get a program called MSI Afterburner, and in that program, by hitting Control F, we can then pull up the curve editor, and what this enabled us to do was lower it down to the lowest voltage setting, which is 700 millivolts. And I found the best clock speeds for this 700 millivolts was around 1620 megahertz. Now you may be thinking, Brian, you're going to be losing a lot of performance, and actually not quite so. I'll pull up some benchmarks on default where the GPU was going over 80 degrees, and we were getting here on Firestrike Extreme, we went down from 23,193 points down to 20,634 points. So we're losing a chunk of performance here, nearly 10%. And then for TimeSpy, we went from 18,736 points down to 7,746. So again, losing a little bit of performance, but not as much as Firestrike Extreme. And then the last benchmark we had here was Unigine Heaven, where we lost a similar amount of performance to TimeSpy, where it was 11,400 down to 10,600 points. So the performance was maximum a 10% loss. However, these are the best two parts of undervolting, was our power consumption. We were coming under 200 watts on usage pretty much most of the time. And actually, in fact, it averaged out around 160 to 170 watts for a 3080 Ti. And also the biggest benefit now was our graphics card is running a lot cooler. And so it's pretty much sitting at 70 degrees even whilst I'm gaming for hours with these undervolts. And so the next benchmark we'll show was Apex Legends, where we were getting at 1080p maximum settings, 255 average FPS in trios, and the 1% and 0.1% lows were very well controlled. And also, you may be wondering, well, Brian, there's not much airflow in this Mini-iTX rig. And here's where I decided to put the thermo imaging camera on top of this build, and the maximum heat points that we saw were really only going into the 50-degree region. So this build, pretty much having ventilation on all different sides of the case, does have it so that all that heat can escape. So now we've finished this build and everything's complete, everything's stable, and I'm happy with everything. It is actually time to talk about the problems that I came into whilst building in an ITX PC. The first thing being was the Noctua NHL12S cooler, which I had this sitting around for quite a while now, at least over a year here at the studio. And when I tried to mount it, there was only LGA 1700 mounting support. And so I didn't have a bracket, but I noticed Noctua does sell a bracket for the LGA 1700 series that will adapt your cooler. But me being me, I didn't want to wait. I just wanted to get this build done as soon as possible. And I actually had access from, in the past, I've hustled a lot of used parts and you come into different brackets. And so I've got a big basket of cooler brackets. And what I found was I was able to have this cooler mount perfectly fine with a Noctua cooler on a Corsair, believe it or not, water cooling bracket, and using those Corsair bolts to attach the bracket on the rear of the motherboard. Then we used the original Noctua brackets on top of those Corsair bolts, and the cooler mounted perfectly. Actually, the mounting pressure was very good, and so there was no problems with the temperatures. Though the second problem we came into was just simply this PCIe Gen riser. Even though it's technically, they say it's PCIe Gen 4, is actually, I believe, only truly Gen 3 compatible, where out of the box, this PC would default with the Z690, since there is a PCIe Gen 4 graphics card, it would default to PCIe Gen 4. And it have above 4G decoding on CAM. Anyhow, guys, going forward, this is going to be my new main PC, which if you look at the size difference compared to some of the other PCs I have around here, this thing is so much smaller. I was actually blown away by how far ITX has come in terms of what you can fit inside the case and how well the cases are designed, but also how much power you can get inside in general, where we've got the 12900K and the 3080 Ti, and this little PC right here is actually more powerful than both my main PCs. So I was really shocked to see how you can just get so much out of ITX nowadays. But admittedly, I do have to undervolt in order to make this thing work 100%. But undervolting, if you guys have followed us in recent months, undervolting is something that I'm actually very passionate about with a lot of the newer stuff, because I believe in the case of the RTX 3000 series cards, as well as the 12th gen CPUs, and even with AMD's Ryzen 5000 CPUs, a lot of these companies are pushing their components to the limit out of the box. And so what that means is they're not giving you the best power efficiency out of the box, especially if you're coupling it with a very solid power supply. So that's what I'm very passionate about now, is undervolting. And in this situation, we lost, I'd say, around 10% performance max, but we were saving over 33% of the power consumption. Not only that, our components aren't going to come into any problems, and the temperatures are also going to be a lot lower, which will increase the life of the components. Anyway, guys, that's it for the absolute beast Mini-iTX PC. I'll leave a list of the parts that we used in today's video in the description below. And also, if you want to build something similar like this, then you can also use this video as a guide. I'll put the settings that I used in the description below too. And with that aside, I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, be sure to hit that like button. Also, let us know in the comment section below if you would change some things in this build. What would you do differently? Love reading those thoughts and opinions. As always, just like this question of the day here, which comes from Kel, and they ask, do you record all your in-person transactions? I buy and sell a ton of stuff on Facebook Marketplace, and I wonder what precautions I should be taking. So in terms of recording in person, I don't usually do that. I will record some transactions with the camera in my car, but in terms of the transactions themselves, I always meet at someone's address or they meet at my place. And that's sort of how we do business where I'm at in Southeast Queensland. If you're meeting someone in a public place, you may wish to get some form of hard proof, because that in the past, the only times I've ever been hosed, I was hosed once in 2017. That time I met someone at a gas station, and of course the part was faulty and there was no recourse for me. And ever since then, I haven't been hosed. So I always meet someone at their place or at my place. And also if they're fishy from the messaging, then I also avoid that. Even in the recent used PC parts hunt we did, I avoided a transaction because it just seemed very fishy. You can check that out. I'll put the link up here. And with that aside, if you guys have stayed this far and you're enjoying that Tech-yes content, be sure to hit that sub button, ring that bell to get the content as soon as it drops. And with that aside, I'll catch you in the next one. Peace out for now. Bye.